Well, if you're just joining us or have just come in from the weight room, once again, my name is Pam Metzger. I'm the director of the Deason Criminal Justice Reform Center at the SMU Dedman School of Law. And I'm so pleased today to be able to facilitate the first in a series of 5 conversations between practitioners and professors, sponsored by the SMU Law Review. This is part of the SMU Law Review's 2021 Symposium on Criminal Legal Reform. And today's topic is policing accountability. I'm so excited to have our panelists here today. Chavis is a professor of law and director of the Criminal Justice Program at Wake Forest University of Law School. She's a national leader in the field of policing accountability, and she thinks a lot about stakeholder participation, police and prosecutorial accountability, and racial profiling. You may have seen her on CNN, NPR, the New York Times, or if you're on the law professor side, law student side, you may have read her works in the University of Illinois Law Review, the Wake Forest, goodness gracious, Wake Forest Law Review, and the Howard Law Review. Walter Katz, who's our other guest, is the Vice President of Criminal Justice at Arnold Ventures, where he focuses on policing, alternatives to arrest, and gun violence. Before he was at Arnold Ventures, Mr. Katz spent more than 2 decades in a variety of public service positions, including as a public defender and then deputy chief of staff in the Chicago mayor's office, where he worked on the issues of public safety. As part of that work, he oversaw an extraordinarily complex police reform effort, was a co-negotiator of a consent decree in 2019, and led the design and implementation of their new Office on Violence Prevention. So he has close experiences working with the police department in developing things like use of force policies. He's chaired a crisis intervention advisory board. And so he comes to us today with a really well-rounded perspective on the nuts and bolts of policing practices, both from the perspective of a practitioner of defense and from someone who's worked on policing activities at the local level in Chicago. So with that, I'm going to turn to Cami and ask her if she could tell us just for a moment a little bit about the way she thinks about the kind of the 3 characteristics of what drive policing.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here for this wonderful conversation. And I look forward to talking with you and Walter. When I think about policing and police culture and where we are in the country in terms of police accountability, I think that there's nothing we can do to improve policing if we don't recognize the culture, the organizational cultures that we're dealing with, and any remedy or solution really has to focus back on that culture. And in my work, I've thought about different characteristics of police culture. And one of them is this sense of group loyalty. So of course, it's really important as a police officer, or you can think about any one of us in any of our jobs, wanting to make sure that we have a cohesive team and that we're working together. The issue with policing is that sometimes this can have very perverse incentives. And we see a lot of group loyalty and how when we think about the code of silence and how that operates to buttress that group loyalty. So that is one characteristic. It's also been, many scholars have talked about the idea, and police officers themselves have talked about the idea that violence is a necessary part of their job as police officers. We see this in a number of different reports dating back to the Christopher Commission report in the wake of the Rodney King beating in the 90s, where police officers thought, well, this is what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to be heavy-handed and authoritarian in my role. And the way we see this today, or we talk about it today, is this concept of a warrior mentality versus a guardian mentality. What is the role of the police officer? Is it to be this authoritarian, or is it to be in more of a service mode? And unfortunately, far too many of our police departments engage in the warrior mode. And then finally, when you have all of this operating, we also know that police officers, or I'm sorry, police agencies, law enforcement agencies, sometimes fail to adequately identify the wrongdoers within their ranks and fail to adequately address that wrongdoing. And so this in and of itself, the failure to address something that you know is happening, really, and this language that I use again from the Christopher Commission report, this is how long we've been dealing with this, is that it not only tolerates a culture where there will be violence and corruption, and not only tolerates that, but it cultivates it when you don't adequately address. So when I go back and think about what can we do in order to reform policing today, any reform, really, we're going to have to first deal with the culture and those three characteristics.
Well, thank you. So I want to turn to Walter. And I know, Walter, you want to hone in a little bit even on what you're going to be writing for this symposium paper. What's your reaction to Cammie's focus on culture? And how do you think about the problem?
Sure, I think the focus is an accurate one, even though culture is very difficult to discern in a police department. I've been up close to quite a few police departments, 3 in particular over an extended period of time. And each of them had their own distinct culture, but these characteristics of the code of silence, of circling the wagons, to be generally opposed to outside oversight, is something which is consistent across a lot of different departments. But I think in the approach I take, and you see it even in what I write about in the article in the forthcoming issue, is about it's more simply than just what's the culture within a department. It is what is the relationship between the police department and the public at large, and what is the relationship between the police department and the political leadership in a city or a county. And I think to a great extent that has been overlooked. Now we see, for example, this year that a number of state legislators are moving in to regulate policing. Policing is interesting as an industry. It is a high-risk industry where about 1,000 people a year die as a result of intentional use of force. Now that's not characterizing whether or not it's good use of force or bad use of force, but it's a fact. About 1,000 people die per year. For an industry where so many of the people that its practitioners come in contact with die per year, would suggest that it should be a regulated profession. And it really is not. There has been a lack of regulation both at the state level and also at the local level. And that is a place where leadership in city councils and mayor's offices and city managers can have a real role to play in areas such as the police budget. Where is the money being spent? How are officers using their time? Collective bargaining, signing off on collective bargaining agreements, which have terms and conditions in them, which makes accountability and transparency and oversight really difficult. Oversight in terms of settlements that it signs off on, and in terms of policy. Those are all areas where we want our policymakers to have a more significant role, which I think is important. And it's because of an absence in exercising that role that there have been community calls for civilian review boards and similar types of external community groups which have an influence over the police department.
All right, so I'm going to ask the question that's probably on a lot of people's minds, which is, okay, so civilian review boards, that's the solution, is that right? And you and I've talked about this a little bit. What's your take?
Not necessarily is the short answer. A lot of people have to agree on what the definition of civilian oversight. A civilian review board is a certain subset of that. It generally is a board of members of the public who have some role to play. And what their role is really matters. So you can have some civilian review boards, which are essentially civilian advisory boards, which look at policies and they may look at significant misconduct cases, and they may provide an opinion. But there's other models of civilian oversight, which I think can have more of an impact. There are inspector general's offices, as you see in New York and Los Angeles and Chicago. There are offices which have independent investigation capacity to essentially investigate either significant uses of forces, again, like in Chicago, like in Los Angeles, or in Seattle, or the ability to investigate serious misconduct investigations. And then, so you have inspector generals, you have investigators, you also have an auditor model where the oversight organization has a role to play in auditing individual cases to see whether or not the investigation by the police department was thorough. So what's the model? And most importantly, what does success look like? Civilian review boards, as I'm defining them, that more of an advisory role, historically, in my view, have not been successful to a great extent because of the amount or lack of amount of authority that they're given. And I would encourage people to look, for example, the LA Police Commission. The LA Police Commission has been in existence since the 1920s during the initial California progressive movement. That police commission is one of the most empowered in the country. They have the power to hire the police chief and appoint them to a 5-year term. By the way, I think that term limits for police chiefs is a really good idea. They set the policy, and they also have the final decision-making authority over whether or not to fire a police officer. That kind of high authority is really important, but it's also viewed as a prestigious position. It's appointed by the mayor. It generally has people who are appointed who already are high-profile individuals within the community, so it has credibility. Now, it's not without controversy, I admit that, but it is at least a model which could be more effective than just simply having a civilian review board.
Okay, so authority and power to act rather than to simply advise or hand-wring, right?
Yes,
Cami,
with a budget and staff.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Say
And
that
with
again.
a budget and a staff. Sorry for
Right.
interrupting.
That's okay. No, I'm glad you said it. For a civilian review board or a citizen oversight or inspector general to be successful, they have to have a budget, they have to have staff, they have to have power. Right? Cami, what are some other things that are on your mind about police accountability? Because I know when we've talked about this before, you've talked about diversifying police forces and the role that that has in this.
Yes, I mean, so there are a number of things, and I know that we'll get to more of the solutions. But I mean, you know, over the years, when you think about, there's case law, right, that governs that regulates police officers and what they can and can't do, and it has, you know, oftentimes been thought, well, if we can have the exclusionary rule to deter police officers from violating constitutional rights, then this in some way will have an impact on police accountability. So there are those types of rules, which, and again, we can obviously see that's woefully inadequate and ineffective on its own. And then there are a number of different, what I like to think of as, when we're talking about how to remedy past things that have happened. Of course, you know, having criminal sanctions for police officers is something that a lot of people think about, and that comes with its own set of issues. And the independent investigation, not having a police department and a local DA's or a local DA's office investigate the local police department after something has occurred. But when we think about that, those are all remedies that happen after someone's rights may have been violated. And again, in the context that we're speaking today, after someone may have been killed, right? So if we want to prevent these things from happening, again, it goes back to thinking about what are some of these things about the culture that we can change. And that's why, and I know that Walter has been involved in the consent decrees, and I'm a big fan of the pattern or practice authority that the federal government has. It has not been used vigorously over the last few years, and of course has not been. The Department of Justice itself is limited in the number of investigations that they can bring. So I think that we have to look at solutions on a local level as well. There's not going to be one thing that is a magic bullet or a silver bullet to solve these issues. The paper that I'm writing is going to focus on this concept of diversifying police departments, because we hear a lot about, well, if the police department were only more diverse, that this would solve our problems. And I want to, of course, I believe that diversity is important for all institutions, and that we're better institutions where we have diverse stakeholders and we can come to better solutions. But I want to push back on that as a little bit, and just again refocus the conversation on culture, because you can have a diverse police department, but if there are failings within that organization, if they're not adequately addressing the code of silence that happens, if they still believe that violence is a part of the job, and if folks aren't going to be adequately supervised or disciplined or in some way, then any officer in the police department is going to take on an aspect of that culture. Black officers have a particular, Black and Latino, Black and brown officers have a particular concern here, because they themselves are often victims of discrimination within those police departments. When we're thinking about who are the supervisors, who are the folks who are in charge of the rank and file, and also when we think about the code of silence, when something happens and you may have a minority officer that wants to report it or sees wrongdoing and wants to blow the whistle, there's quite a bit of evidence that these officers face retaliation. So I know a lot of police departments at the local level have talked about things like the duty to intervene, like what we saw, unfortunately, with the Derek Chauvin case, the murder trial that's beginning Monday for the murder of George Floyd. We saw not just the actions of Derek Chauvin, but we saw the officers, the bystanders there, who folks who didn't intervene. So I know that at the local levels, there's been a lot of emphasis on that, and we have to, and that is good. It is laudable that we should be doing that. The problem is that we really, again, have to think about the officers within we can't just have that duty to intervene without very strong whistleblower protection, and again, protection for discrimination of officers that may report such wrongdoing.
So what I'm hearing here are kind of two different themes, and one is really about outside in. That's Walter talking about accountability to external forces, right? In this case, an inspector general or an empowered citizen review board. And what Cammie's talking about is, look, we have to change the force at some level on the inside out, not just by diversifying the force, but by providing protections for officers who come from diverse communities who may not feel empowered to engage in the kind of accountability that we want police to exercise on their own. So Walter, you write about police unions and their role in all of this. Can you talk a little bit about unions and maybe touch a little bit on the relationship between the power of police unions and the civil rights movement and how that kind of has developed?
Yeah, and so I'm going to sound really cynical, so I'm going to warn you ahead of time. But you know, the role of the Black officer and a Hispanic officer is, I think, already from the first day they stepped into the academy, there's already been a degree of self-selection. I was just talking to a researcher earlier today who remarked upon seeing data from one hiring process where a lot of Black officers were dropping out right at the physical training part of the application process. And why is that? Because that's the first time that they came face to face with instructors within that academy. And they may have been noting things about the culture of the department, which was off-putting to them. So they just stopped. Regarding Latino officers, you know, I had oversight over a very large sheriff's department on the West Coast for a number of years. I was on that team. And what you see there with Latino officers is that they tend to be very anglicized. In fact, there's a great significant amount of tension between those law enforcement officers and actually immigrant community members. So it is definitely not unified. Now, this ties right into the union question. You know, if you go back into the history of police unions, it really goes back to about the 19-teens, where in the late, about 1917, 1919, right after World War I, there's an increased movement for unionization, and that included police officers. Police officers went on strike in Boston during Woodrow Wilson's administration. They went on strike for several days and riots broke out in Boston. People died. The reaction, the backlash was swift. Essentially, the entire police force that went on strike in Boston was fired and replaced. And from that moment onwards, there was extraordinary hostility to the idea of police officers unionizing. Then we get to the early 1960s with a real push for public employee unionization. and which included police officers. And they weren't making that much traction until 1968. And what occurred in 1968 was the civil unrest, which really began in the mid-1960s, a couple of years beforehand, but really accelerated after the assassination of Dr. King. Well, the calls were for greater control over police departments, calls for stopping police brutality. It led to the Kerner Commission, which made a number of recommendations, which called out racism in policing and violence in policing. And the response by police was, these riots occurred because of permissiveness. And we are threatened. We are threatened by this idea of civilian oversight. And they pushed and got unionization. And they used the threat of the unrest from the summer of 68 and the summers before as a justification that police officers were under siege. So there's a direct connection between the civil rights movement, unrest during the 1960s, and civilian oversight and police unions. And since that point in the late 60s, early 70s, as police unionization developed, they've only gained momentum and they've become more powerful. And that results in collective bargaining agreements with terms and conditions, which go deep into accountability. You know, when can an investigation start? By when does it have to be finished? Who's allowed to be in an interview room? How much notice can an officer get before he's actually interviewed? He can, in some contracts, even allow for officers who are subjects of an investigation to see the evidence before they're questioned. And if there is sustained misconduct, there are washout periods in how soon the materials are taken out of the personnel file, let alone restrictions on transparency to the public about misconduct. That is the role that unions have played over the last several decades, and is probably one of the most significant structural barriers to reform and accountability and transparency that there is in policing.
So those of you out there in the audience can't see it, but Cammie's over here nodding her head really, really hard as all these things are being said. And I'm kind of bobbing along too. My thought is, of course, we also can't get police officers to be forced to disclose employment history or disciplinary history in Brady, where you have a constitutional right to accountability. So it goes very, very deep, right? It's not just the freestanding accountability, but it butts up against, I think, every piece of the process. Cammie, let me let you address this, if you would.
Yes, I think, I mean, again, Walter said so much there when we're thinking about anything that you'd like to do around accountability, right? Let's think about the concept of the problem officer. We know that, and I actually think this statistic is from Chicago, that like in one department, it's like 95% of the officers were responsible for 95% of the complaints. So let's think about that again. 5% of the officers, a small number of officers, were actually responsible for most of the complaints. Now, when we think about violence prevention, we know the same is true there, right? If you can target the small number of people in a community who are actually engaging in violence, you can take care of the problem. The problem is that whether, again, police unions or just other internal cultural forces really don't allow us to adequately address those numbers of folks, because the discipline process, all of that will go through the collective bargaining process. So unfortunately, it can be a huge impediment to any type of meaningful cultural reform. The things that you'd like to do, the changes that you'd like to make inside of your department, if they touch on those issues that have been identified in the collective bargaining agreement, will be difficult, if not impossible, to change. And I think it's also unfortunate. One thing to think about is that when we do have even some of the most egregious instances of police violence, the unions, they rush out, they have the spokesperson, and it's the benefit of that, all of those things. But wouldn't it be something for the union to say, look, we are by and large 95% or more of us doing a great job, and we really want to root out this small, this minority of officers that are causing us a problem. And so it's never framed that way. And I think that it's a huge impediment to accountability and cultural change.
So let me ask you guys then the $64,000 question, and I'm dating myself by putting that dollar value on it. What's the first step in accountability? We got some great questions in the chat. I'm going to get to them that are specific questions about changing police culture, changing police accountability. But I'm going to make you each king and queen, czar and czarina of policing. What's the first thing you do? Walter, I'll throw it to you first.
I think that, as we've been looking at Arnold Ventures at the structural barriers to reform and thinking through what the role that the states can play, which I think is significant. I think one of the most significant areas is licensing of officers. Officers are already required to have some sort of licensing or certification if they're qualified to act as police officers after they get through the academy. The majority of states have some sort of decertification regime, but usually one can only become decertified, i.e. lose their license as a police officer only upon conviction of a felony. About half the states allow for delicensure for some enumerated misdemeanors, but very few states actually allow for decertification because of founded misconduct. An officer getting convicted of a crime is a much higher standard than an officer having sustained findings of excessive force against them or for not telling the truth. And decertification, and so think about discipline right now as terms of an internal sealed off box. If there's an allegation of misconduct against an officer, generally that is going to be investigated by their agency, and they might find a person out of policy, and that person may get a suspension or maybe a written reprimand, and that's it. So an officer's risk analysis, an officer who may be prone to engaging in misconduct, will be what is going to happen to me internally. Now, if you talk to a public defender, or you talk to a doctor, or you talk to a slew of professions who are licensed by the state, you even hear a public defender say this, and I heard this myself. That is not worth losing my bar license over it. And that's because your client just told you some crazy thing that he wants you to do, which means, putting a witness on the stand to commit perjury, which is not worth your career over. As a police officer, think about how the incentives will be different if you're thinking of, this is not just going to lead to a suspension within my department, but because of this misconduct, I could actually lose my statewide license and my career would end. In my view, would change the incentives for misconduct.
That's a great suggestion. Let me follow up on that a second, because I think not everyone in our audience will be familiar with this concept. But am I correct that as it stands right now, a police officer can be fired from one department and simply go get a job at another department because there is no central licensing?
Yes, that is John Rappaport and Ben Grunwald did a study in the state of Florida where they were able to document this concept of the wandering officer, so that if you lose your job in one place, you just go off to another department. What their study found is that they tend then to go to smaller departments. They tend to go to departments which are less well-resourced, which have larger minority communities, especially Black communities. And lo and behold, those types of officers are more likely to re-engage in serious misconduct once they're rehired elsewhere. So the concept of the wandering officer is an important one. Look, if a school teacher abuses a kid and they lose their job at a school district, our expectation is that they'll probably lose their license and they can't just pick up and go to a different school district to abuse another child. Why do we not have that same expectation for police officers?
Okay. Cammie, your turn. You're queen of all you survey. What are you doing?
Well, I'm so glad you followed, because that's exactly what I was going to say, is that, I totally agree with the licensing, but then we've got this nationwide problem we've got to fix. If something has happened in one jurisdiction, why do you get to move on? If I could do anything, so my answer is might be a little bit surprising, but I would start not necessarily with police agencies and what they should do, but I would think about our state legislatures and federal as well, and think about the substantive criminal law. Police officers can only interact or think about arresting someone if there's a statute or law that allows them to do so. And we have there's so many things. I think the example, when we think about Eric Garner and selling loose cigarettes, and we think about allegedly selling loose cigarettes, and think about George Floyd and allegedly passing a $20 counterfeit bill, which is why the police officers say that they approached him in the first place. If you can imagine those two situations, if we wouldn't say that we need to send an armed police officer after you for such a minor infraction, then we might have two people that were still alive today. So, and there's countless other examples. And so I think that our substantive criminal law is really where we start. And the other thing that I would say is really allowing, there's not a police department in our country, not a chief, who will tell you that they're not implementing community policing. When you think about, you say, well, what model of policing do you use? They're all going to say community policing. But we really need to get back to the tenets of community policing and what that actually means. And to me, it means empowering communities. And this is very much kind of, related to what Walter was saying earlier, but the communities need to be setting their own priorities for law enforcement. And we know that many communities, communities that are impacted by violent crime would rather officers focus on investigating and preventing those crimes than focusing on shaking down these teenagers for lower level drug offenses, right? So we really have to get back to allowing communities, empowering them, and to set their own criminal justice priorities. And I think thinking about those two things, then we can kind of think more detailed about what needs to happen within the police department.
So let me unpack those for a second, because those are two very interesting and very different concepts. The first is we've over-criminalized. And every time we over-criminalize, we give police more and more laws to enforce. When they got more and more laws to enforce, they have more and more ways to intrude in people's lives. This is another great history lesson, right? Just like unions, police unions come from the civil rights movement, right? And this reaction, this overcriminalization comes largely from an effort to shore up the Fourth and Fifth Amendment. At least if you buy the argument that Bill Stuntz has made or did make it over and over again, the idea is that the excessive criminalization of things like broken taillights, right, comes from that effort. So that's one concept. The other concept is, and I think maybe this is the one most closely tied to some of what Walter has said, is that we need to have community policing means something different than just a buzzword. Oh yeah, we're into community policing. What is that? Well, I'm in the community, right? We want something that's actually meaningful. Walter, I know you've thought about this. I think you've talked about, I've talked a little bit about democratic policing. Can you expand on what that might look like in your experience working with police communities?
Sure, so much here. The professor is right. We're living in this environment of the paradox of over-policing and under-policing. And over-policing is driven by over-criminalization, which not only means, a lot of felonies, but a whole lot of misdemeanors and infractions. If we think about traffic stops, for example, traffic stops are allowed for essentially anything. And if you've ever been along on a ride along with a police officer, you'll see some officers basically just sitting and waiting. And once they see a car, for example, I've been in one where, this officer had a pretty good instinct that the driver is probably a former prison inmate, a former prisoner, just based on his demeanor, what he was looking like. He's making some assumptions. So he wanted to check him out. So he's just waiting for a minor infraction to justify pulling the vehicle over, so that he could then run the identification to see what this guy was about and to see whether or not maybe he's on parole and his search conditions. Right now, one could say, well, that's a prisoner. He's a parolee. Why not? But those types of basically bingo occur day in and day out. And that is why, maybe I forget the exact statistic, but I think only 6% of all vehicle searches actually yield contraband. Well, that means there's 94% of the people who've been stopped who are largely black and brown, basically just have had their liberty intruded upon in the name of public safety. So that's the over-criminalization. The under-policing comes from the people from those exact same communities who are living with a great deal of street violence are wondering, why aren't the police here stopping the violence? Why aren't they effectively investigating violent crime? Let me tell you one reason, because they're busy stopping cars with stupid broken taillights. They should instead be focusing on shootings and homicides and rapes and robberies. So it's a matter of priorities. And that's why I tie it right back to the civilian policymakers. They are setting the tone. A city council, a mayor's office, a city manager, a state legislator, they set the tone for what is important. So we have to be deciding as a culture what should be policed and what should not be policed, and what is policed should be done constitutionally.
So get real practical with me for a minute. You go to a new city, the policing there is in disarray. I'll pull from one of our questions. I'm not suggesting that this is only in Dallas, but someone said, well, who's from Dallas, and says, well, what about the police academy? Can we start there with dealing with training in terms of how to think about communities? Does it matter who the experts are that are training? Is there a model when police walk in the door that works, or is that too late?
So, you know, what's interesting is I do agree that the culture starts at the police academy. And I've actually written about having, again, when we're talking about community, about having community members have some choice in who their police officers would be. When you have a job interview, you usually interview with the constituents or stakeholders, and how many jurisdictions really allow community members to participate in the selection of the police officers. And so that is one way. But another way is, I think that's right. You typically have at police academies, you'll have officers who work at that academy and work within those agencies. And again, the training can be disparate, right? So you might get a certain set of folks who come through and are trained in one way. But I certainly think that there are ways to shore up the training. And I don't think that we focus, again, when we think about the current role of police officers, and this of course has been in the news, and thinking about how can we restrict the role of law enforcement in some ways, but there's quite a bit of what we call community caretaking that we're asking officers to do. And if that is the case, then that's very different than investigating and preventing the violent crimes that Walter mentioned. So we've got different individuals with, we were expecting one individual to have all of these multiple skill sets. And it just, I think it never was a great model and didn't work, but we've grown into this situation of we're asking officers to be social workers. We're asking them to, look at, intervene when there's a traffic stop, all of those times. Sorry, not traffic stop, but like a car accident. So we're asking them to do all of these different things. Who they're enforcing, seatbelt laws and again, minor traffic violations. That is very different than the investigation. And when you have a large police department, you can have differentiation. You'll have different units that do that, but think about the vast majority of our police departments in the United States are over 18,000 local police departments. You often have people who are doing one role one day and the same, a different role a different day. So we really have to pay attention to that as well.
Walter, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, what I would add is that if one were really to go in with a blank canvas and start over, to me, policing in this country could look very different. 18,000 police departments is just too many. I don't think there are 18,000 five-star chiefs in this country. We should be rethinking policing and restructuring it, at least explore it, about breaking police agencies now into consolidating them into more regional departments. And what you get from that, you can have greater oversight and control. And I think you can also unify your training. We have far too many training academies. In some states, yes, a city police department, their own academy may do a better job. But many cities rely upon the local community college to be the training academy. So we have too many academies, and the standards are very basic standards, which includes a lot of use of force training, defensive tactics training, firearms training, a little bit of de-escalation, a little bit of Fourth Amendment. And I think if we really go back and do a rethink about policing, fewer departments, and we should be looking at other models for academy training. Look at Scandinavia, for example. If you really want to do a moonshot exercise to rethink training, in Scandinavia, where they have a unified police department, a national police department, every officer first attends and has to graduate from their 3-year-long policing university. And they essentially get a college degree in a wide range of skills, including psychology, including social work, including policing. So when they come on that 3-year training, they're actually professionalized police officers who've not been trained in this paramilitary model. Now, that would take a great amount of courage from a governor to say, we're going to completely redo how we train officers in our state. But I think we should be far more creative in thinking about this and really thinking about what are the different models that we want to do, because the current model, which has some value in a country with 300 million guns, also has some social costs that we have to take into account.
So I'm going to ask if one of y'all can talk a minute about what's happening in Denver right now and the experience with sending out people who aren't police officers to manage certain kinds of situations. Can one of y'all comment on that and how that might be a different model? I don't see any volunteers.
I was just going to say, I don't know about Denver. I won't speak to Denver specifically, but I know that there are a lot of agencies that have, for example, like crisis intervention teams, right? And these are they have police officers as well as social workers, as well as mental health workers and folks like that. And these police officers who are on these teams receive specialized training. But I have this debate a lot in the class that I teach, and thinking about well, what happens if one of those situations potentially turns violent? Then do you have, are you putting other folks' lives in jeopardy? But the point is that often when you have folks that come out with the right training, they're able to de-escalate situations. They're able to, quite frankly, take into custody someone who might be a danger to themselves or danger to others. I think for many communities of color, we don't understand when we see so many people who have already been alleged to have committed very violent acts, and they are easily taken away in handcuffs, where others, it's almost like a shoot first mentality. And that is the sentiment that I think a lot of folks in communities of color have. They don't get the same benefit of the doubt as other communities.
So, and I apologize because I committed the cardinal sin among law professors, which is I asked a question about reading that wasn't assigned. But I asked about Denver, and the reason I asked, because I take your point, right? And which is that police officers need a wide range of skills, right? And they need to be able to distinguish among situations. The reason I was asking about Denver is because Denver actually went an entirely different direction, and they created a third track. So 911 operators now have 3 choices for who they refer calls to: police, fire department, or a support team. And that goes to a medic and a clinician, no police involved at all. And they go out there, and my understanding is that in 6 months, they were actually able at the 911 relay, right, to distinguish between who needed a police response and who needed a 911 response. My understanding is that team responded to something like 750 phone calls, and not one required the police. But to your point, right, if you don't have that kind of alternative programming, who goes out for the mental health support or the person who's homeless? It's a police response. Walter, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, that's something in Arnold Ventures, which we've actually invested quite a few resources in philanthropically, both to evaluate and to pilot alternative response models. Historically, we've really focused on high utilizers of services, those who come in frequent contact, not only with police, but also fire, as well as emergency departments and hospitals, and frequently cycle in and out of jails. And so how can we better find interventions for those individuals, which is not focused on arrest and incarceration? In Denver, the Denver STAR program, which I think has been around or active since last June, is intriguing as an alternative response model. They only respond to 750 calls. So what is it like to scale up? And what is it like to scale up, for example, at nighttime? My understanding is, I don't know whether or not they respond to calls, for example, the family disturbance calls or things like that. They're primarily focused on mental health, behavioral health calls. So we'll see, but one of the things that you can look out for is that there'll be further funding for evaluations of the effects of programs like that, the CAHOOTS program in Eugene, Oregon, and other types of both co-responder models, which the professor discussed, or alternative responder models like in Denver.
So we had another, go ahead, Cami.
Well, no, I was just going to add that what that does show you, though, is that we need to be creative in our solutions, and I always say that you can protect folks' rights and you can keep the public safe, and it's not mutually exclusive. Like, we can actually do both, but we have to have the will to try these new models and to experiment. And so I think the federal government, the Biden administration can do when we're thinking about police reform is, give some money and incentivize some local communities to come up with different programs like this with an eye to decreasing police violence.
Thanks. I want to just warn our audience really quickly at this point that Professor Chavis has to go at 4 o'clock Eastern time, which is 3 o'clock Central. So we're only going to have her for about another 10 or 12 minutes if you want to be real precise. So I want to just highlight that. The rest of us will be here for, Walter and I will be here for another 15 minutes after that. So, excuse me, just a little warning. Woo, got all choked up there. So let me ask another question that's come up in the chat, which is, well, what about qualified immunity? Why doesn't qualified immunity, why isn't getting rid of qualified immunity the key that's going to unlock all the solutions to policing accountability? And if y'all could see the looks on our guests' faces right now, you would know that they don't think that's going to happen.
I'll take a crack at this. There's a certain list of things I have which are viewed as remedies, which I want to say, well, hold on a second. That list includes residency requirements, implicit bias training, subpoena powers for civilian review boards, and qualified immunity. Qualified immunity, what does it do? It's a troubling policy, right? It's not statutory. It was created by the Supreme Court as a response to 42 USC 1983 civil rights actions, and essentially says that unless there's clearly established precedent in that circuit, it requires clearly established precedent in that circuit to put an officer on notice that certain conduct is unconstitutional. And without that, the officer has qualified immunity. So there have been many instances where an individual is seeking civil redress for what they thought was unconstitutional policing, where they suffered harm, and the case gets dismissed because the officer is able to claim qualified immunity. And the argument is that if we would end qualified immunity, officers would be held more responsible. My caveat is that the reality of how liability works right now is that the vast majority of findings against officers do not come out of their pockets. UCLA law professor Joanna Schwartz has written extensively about it. And somewhere in the study period that she looked at, about 99.5%, and this is not an exaggeration, 99.5% of settlements and judgments against an officer were indemnified by their employee agency. Now, I get it, indemnification is not the same thing as, well, the important thing is when there's indemnification, the plaintiff is made whole. There's still the issue, though, about whether or not qualified immunity should kick in the first place. And there's a secondary conversation there about municipal liability under the Monell Doctrine. Extraordinarily complicated issue. I just don't necessarily think that ending qualified immunity will have the positive effects that people are hoping for.
And just for the folks out there who aren't familiar with practice, let me just say it can take years to get one of these judgments. I want to just throw that in there. Cammie, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. We've got a lot of different remedies, different, what do you want to call it, a Swiss Army knife of remedies in your toolbox or whatever the analogy. There are a lot of different things, and qualified immunity or abolishing or restricting qualified immunity is one of those things. I think that it is, again, I share Walter's concerns that it's not going to be the one thing that takes us over the edge. A lot of law enforcement professionals would also say, and then how am I going to get the very best police officers? How am I going to get quality people who want to go into this profession knowing that they don't have immunity for some of those gray areas? The other reason when I think about qualified immunity is, again, certainly something that ending it, something that we could investigate, but it is still one of those backward looking policies. And as you said, and it takes years for the case to come. The officer's not going to pay out of pocket, so it's not necessarily going to deter or have any deterrent value for that. And so I really think we need to focus on proactive things to prevent the violence, the corruption from happening in the first place. And that is, again, coming back to some of the things that both Walter and I have talked about in terms of the culture.
So we've been talking about culture, police accountability, change, silence, consequences, behavior shaping. I have not heard the phrase body worn cameras. Do y'all have a view on what role they can and should play? Cammie, I'll let you go first because I know you have to run off in a minute.
Well, I was going to say, I do. I think a lot about law enforcement and technology. And the first thing I would say, and this was also mentioned in the 21st Century Task Force on Policing, is that technology is there. It is ever changing. And, law enforcement agencies should have the ability to use technology to keep the public safe. They were very clear in that document, and I think rightly so, to warn us, however, that technology does not come without consequences, and there can be unintended consequences. I am a proponent of body-worn cameras because it is, again, another piece of evidence that we may not have in many of these encounters. But like most things, we see that there are problems. There can be some privacy concerns, which I think with a good policy, a good drafted policy, and a policy that's enforced, we can counter that and work with it. But the problem is that there's some limited studies, and we really, even though we have seen some limited studies showing that when officers are wearing these cameras, they act differently. Folks who are interacting with them act differently. We also have plenty of instances where, despite having those cameras, the officers are engaging in conduct that as if no one were watching or cared. And so I think that that's not to say that we don't need them. We do, but we also need to make sure that when they're and I would say body-worn cameras and any other types of technology, again, you've got to let the community know that their actions are going to be taped with police officers. Be transparent about when officers are supposed to turn those cameras on, what triggering conditions. And when officers don't meet that, it goes back then to the discipline and the discipline and supervision, and making sure that there are consequences when they're not operating their cameras properly. But there's a lot beyond accountability that having these cameras can help with, and that is the fact it can be really valuable for training opportunities to go back through, having supervisors regularly go back through to see how officers indeed are interacting with the folks that they're policing. We just don't have a lot of police departments who actually have the resources or placing their resources in a way that allows them to do that.
Thanks. Walter, any thoughts on that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I've been at a couple of agencies as they've rolled out body-worn cameras or piloting those, heard the initial resistance by officers to having body-worn cameras. And so I do have a couple of observations. The first thing is that I think on the whole, they are a net positive in increasing accountability. However, the research on asking the questions of are body-worn cameras a success is that it depends. And the it depends is what question are you asking? So what we've seen so far, for example, is that the presence of body-worn cameras does not decrease the use of force necessarily, or the severity of the use of force. And so I think just using that metric, the evidence is not that clear. There has not been as much research so far in the question of whether or not body-worn cameras are successful in increasing accountability. Is it holding officers to account? Now, why is it though that it hasn't decreased force that much? And this is where I need to ask people to kind of think about use of force and the standards for use of force. The reality is that the vast majority of the force used by police officers is found to be in policy. A very small percentage of force is out of policy. An even smaller percentage of force is found to rise to criminal conduct. And we see this if there are internal investigations of force or external agency investigations of force. The outcomes don't change significantly that much. It's a question of what is our force standard. So we really need to be thinking about what do we want body-worn cameras to do? What do we want our use of force policies to say? And what is the dividing line between excessive force and reasonable force? And those are all kind of these big meta questions, but they are important questions.
Well, thank you so much for that response. Before she has to jump off, I just want to say thank you to Professor Chavis, who's going to be jumping off now to go to her next meeting. I really appreciate you taking this time to join us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And for those of you who are still on with us, stick around because Walter and I are now going to get into the dark, dirty underbelly of unions, collective bargaining, and what's going on with policing, because I found this argument fascinating. I think
is this the after party?
Is the after party, man. This is where the action is, right? So I was really, really intrigued, first of all, by this kind of paradigm, right? I've always, the fact that police unions are the inverse of what we think of as being progressive, although we traditionally associate unions with progressiveness, right? But your notion of democratizing what goes on in collective bargaining in police unions, can you unpack that for us?
So for a great extent, what happens in collective bargaining is completely sealed off from the public. And, I've been involved in collective bargaining with a police union. So what occurs is that the city, as the employer, has a set of proposals. For example, this particular city I was working with had their economic package, wages and benefits, and then a separate package on accountability and a separate package on work conditions. And so you then submit that set of proposals to the other side. They'll take that. You will schedule a meeting, which could be weeks or even months in advance. The initial meeting is often an extraordinary amount of posturing and umbrage that the city would want to do this, or that. And there's all sorts of scare tactics and worst case scenarios that could occur. And then this rhythm, this play now goes on for honestly, for months, if not years at a time. There's some police departments where their prior collective bargaining agreement came to an end. The term came to an end 2-3 years ago. And this negotiation is still going on for the next contract, which will, when it comes out, it's also going to include probably a pay raise with retroactive pay going back to when that last contract came to an end. In all of that, the public has no say or no visibility into what's occurring in many states. Some states actually prohibit there being any transparency. They prohibit the disclosure of the proposals and of the counter proposals. Other states have sunshine laws. For example, the state of Florida, which requires posting of proposals. Some even go so far as to allow, if the public chose, the public can be present during negotiation sessions. For the most part, that doesn't occur very often, but in states with no transparency, essentially, the public and policymakers don't actually see what that collective bargaining agreement looks like until it goes in front of the city council. And that was taken in my law review, the article I'm writing for the SMU Law Review, which talks about public participation, democratizing the collective bargaining process. It opens with a passage from a letter to the editor by the president of a police union in Maryland, who said, who responds to an external agency's report analyzing the collective bargaining agreement and said, the report said, we can't figure out what this agreement means. We can't even figure out what the parties have agreed to. The side letters, the memorandums of understandings, we can't understand it, and we're experts in this. And the letter to the editor by the president of the police union said, no one else needs to understand this agreement other than us and the city manager. Everyone else can go pound sand. Now, if you think about the breadth of these collective bargaining agreements that we talked about before, what an impact they can have on transparency and accountability, that perspective is completely counterproductive to police legitimacy.
So let me stop you there because I want to reflect on this. The police chief said our union collective bargaining agreement is nobody's business.
That the police union president said that.
Right. Police union president says it's none of your damn business to the community and the people who are interested in the policing. That's an enormous statement, I think. The fact that he felt comfortable saying it publicly about how far away we are from a universe in which the communities that are being policed are viewed as being the driving force in what kind of policing occurs. Right? That epitomizes the problem, right?
It is stunning, and and I place a lot of the blame. Look, in my view, and having been a public defender who totally believes in zealously representing his client, I get it. Police unions leadership, their responsibility is to zealously represent and protect their members. And one can quibble with whether to go too far or not. But there's another side of that bargaining, which is the city itself. They're the ones who are agreeing to these contracts, and they're the ones who are approving them. And they're the ones who are also allowing them to be in a form where it's almost impossible to understand what is in there.
Is there an argument, because another term we haven't talked about is defund the police. I mean, is there an argument that police unions have done their job too well? And that's why policing is so troubled? And that's why you're seeing people go to this, set aside the Overton window arguments, but that's why you're seeing people take this position of, okay, it's wrong. Put the money elsewhere. Let's figure out something different. Is this a case of too much success for the unions?
I think you may have something there. I mean, to me, the call for civilian review boards is a call by members of the community saying that our civil political leadership has failed. If we had confidence that they are appropriately regulating their police department, have the right oversight over the police chief, we wouldn't have to be calling for these civilian review boards. And frankly, these choices, budgets are choices. There are, in many ways, they're moral documents. And then if a police department budget is, let's say, $2 billion, which is the police department budget, for example, for the city of Chicago, and then your budget for an Office of Violence Prevention is like $1 million, you're signaling what your policy priorities are. And so that is where choices can be made. And so the community is, of course, saying, look, we've been watching this now for decades. We've been seeing this story play out. People are still being shot in the streets. Mm-hmm. We still have rising violent crime. These crimes are, a relationship between us and the police is discouraging people from reporting violent crimes. Only about 45% of Title I of violent crimes are reported to the police. And of homicides that are reported to the police, I think all homicides are, but let's say shootings, only about less than 60% of all homicides are actually cleared, right? shootings, non-fatal shootings, the clearance rate is even lower. So this whole combination here about decreased effectiveness, decreased trust, the decreased trust circles back to decreased effectiveness. So of course, members in the community are saying, we've been trying this now for decades. It's time to take a new approach.
Well, what you're saying reminds me of kind of the experience in San Francisco when Jeff Adachi put folks together and said, okay, let's reorganize how we allocate resources. And he was talking to the DA's office primarily, but let's focus on the murders and the rapes and not so much on the misdemeanors and the infractions. And let's see if we can turn our attention to the things that our communities want us to focus on. And that was coming from a defender. So let me switch the lens here and ask you a question that I almost never ask, because like you, I'm a cynic. I'm inherently negative and curmudgeonly, and tend to believe things are always going to get worse unless something really radical happens. But let me ask you this: who's doing it right? If we were going to look around the country and say, okay, that's a place that we should look to for lessons in what works, who's doing it right?
Well, I guess it depends sort of what is the what. For example, on crisis intervention and behavioral health response, you can look to a city like Tucson, where the city, as well as the police department, I think have been really progressive in thinking that through. If you look at, let's start from the ground up and redesign a police agency, one that is more responsive to the public, you can look at examples like Camden, New Jersey, right? That was a complete rethink. Maybe it's a rethink that maybe other jurisdictions should be considering as well. What if we totally shut down this one department and started over? What would it look like? So there are possibilities like that. When it comes to civilian oversight, I think you have a number of cities who've been thinking very carefully about it. I do think that a combination role for various agencies makes a lot of sense. So for example, you have a city like Seattle with an Office of Police Accountability, the OPA, which investigates misconduct. You have an inspector general who looks at more of the systemic issues. And then you have a community board, which really looks at policy and is a platform for community. I think all those are helpful, but none of them are perfect.
So let me follow up on Seattle for a second. Does Seattle's success in those areas, and I know it's been a troubled police department in many ways, how much of that ties into programs like LEAD, which is law enforcement-led assistance with diversion? I mean, are they connected, those kinds of efforts to change what policing does? Are they linked to the kinds of community engagement and oversight you're describing?
Yeah, well, Seattle is such an interesting city because in many ways, I think if you would have asked a question like 2.5 years ago, what is one of the most successful consent decree cities in the country? I think, for the most part, the answer would be Seattle and Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. Then things got a little bit sideways. In full disclosure, I was part of a team that was contracted with the city of Seattle at the behest of a court order saying that the court was very concerned with the post-discipline appeals process, which the city had negotiated with their police officers guild, and wanted an examination of that. So I was part of that team and I met with a lot of those folks in Seattle. In my view, it's a city which was going in the right direction. It had multiple layers of civilian oversight. It was doing progressive projects like LEAD. It was trying to move forward. And there's a certain irony that in the post-George Floyd era, it is the cities which had police chiefs who are willing to embrace progressive reforms because they are in cities that had progressive thinking, were the cities which were most likely to end up replacing their police chief as a reaction to George Floyd. Now, I'm not endorsing or critiquing anything which occurred during the protest in Seattle, but it is, I think, an irony that the progress that has been made in some of these cities has also opened the door towards perhaps a degree of impatience to let's now go, we haven't gone far enough, let's go further. And I think we need to be, really need to follow the evidence as to which reforms are successful. And of course, when we say what is success, we really have to define what we mean by success.
Yeah, I agree with all that. So before we close it out, we have a number of law students who are watching or who are going to be watching this video, particularly students on the SMU Law Review. And of course, law students now are enormously engaged in thinking about questions of racial equity, of social justice, and of criminal legal reform. What would you tell a law student or someone who's not a law student, someone who is a citizen in the community who's watching or listening and says, I want to do something, but I don't know how. There's this enormous bureaucracy. What does one person do? What would you tell them to go do?
For folks who are not law students and who are not contemplating becoming law students, I'd say get aware and get informed. There are examples where community activism has had a real impact. I looked at the city of Austin and what the Austin Justice Coalition did in breaking open the collective bargaining process. The community was at the table, or if not at the table, at least in the room and demanding change. And they saw some real changes in their last contract. Does it mean that everything's been fixed in Austin? Not by any stretch of the imagination, but movement was made. But by getting involved, by asking, how are the police spending their money? How are they spending their time? What are their policies? What kind of lawsuits are they settling? How much force are they using? How many traffic stops are they committing? Who is being stopped? Who is being searched? Are we seeing evidence of racial disparities? Those are all questions that have to be asked. For a law student, this is an extraordinary moment. You know, I went to law school in the early 1990s. I became a public defender. I was a public defender for 17 years. But there's a different model of public defending back then. I was a litigator first and foremost. It was not my role to be thinking about my clients more holistically. My focus was on what got them arrested and what is the most effective pathway I can take to try to get them home as soon as possible. Once they got home, it's really not my focus to worry that they're not going to get rearrested again. So I think in making a pitch for being involved on the ground as a litigator, as a public defender is my bias. But I think it's a great, but I really believe that you need to be in a position to take in a broad range of information and perspectives to be able to try to problem solve some of these intractable challenges that we've had in the criminal justice system. And that's not just policing, that includes what happens at pretrial and bail and trials and discovery and incarceration and reintegration and in community supervision.
Well, thank you. And I want to put an extra underscore and exclamation point after what you just said, particularly about law students. I want to point out to those who are joining us today that this is just the first in a 5-part series. Other topics that we're going to be covering with professors and practitioners are racial injustices, bail reform, prosecution, and public defense. And like Walter, that's near and dear to my heart. So we are at the end of our program. I want to thank you so very much, Walter, for joining us. This was terrific. I want to thank all of you out there who joined us. Please do take time to register for the remainder of the series. If you can't join us, you can always look for our programs up on YouTube, where they're available to you 24/7. They can cure your insomnia or get you charged up in the morning. But either way, we hope you'll join us. And thank you again for being here. So long.